I want to give those watching this the most practical tool I can for how you can always deeply help in any kind of crisis circumstance. And it loops back to this power dynamic piece I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm going to explain it by way of, well, modeling it. The most powerful thing we can do in any kind of circumstance where we are seeking to help others is to listen for what's good and well and strong and reflect that back, while also listening for what's not working. But to begin by reflecting what's good.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Help me welcome Donnie Maclurcan, who is a part of a remarkable number of people in the Southern Oregon area who are helping to rebuild a couple of communities that were devastated in recent fires. What's unique about Donnie and the others is that they're looking to generate entirely new possibilities in this rebuilding effort. These communities have the possibility of being rebuilt in a way that brings forth social justice issues, economic justice issues, and the sustainable community as a real possibility in Southern Oregon. Quite an extraordinary conversation with Donnie Maclurcan. Alrighty, welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am your faithful host, Dean Walker, here for about the 5th year of doing this. And this is the year 2020, and this is the year to end all years for me, in my experience, that I think for many, many people around the world, and particularly in the USA, just seems to be a never-ending parade of challenges to our ability to stay present and somewhat aware in the face of larger and larger stressors. If you've followed this podcast with any regularity, you know that I want to say maybe a couple of weeks ago now, I read an article from Medium that was really kind of an update about some of the recovery efforts that were happening in a very homespun way. People coming together in the community of Ashland and nearby Talent in Phoenix, and so there, I'll be putting the link to that episode and that article, and you can follow all that. We'll be referring to it quite a bit in today's conversation, and today I get the opportunity to speak with the first person that's mentioned in that article as part of the coordination of many aspects of what that article's talking about, and that is Donnie Maclurcan. Donnie, it's really great to speak with you. I had the privilege of just getting to know you a little better by your presence in what I thought was just a great little conference in Ashland, Oregon, a couple of years back that was hosted by Holly Trular. And unfortunately, we've lost her to the greater Denver area. So I don't know if and when she's ever coming back. And I was kind of hoping for more of those conferences and more of her special work that she does in so many different dimensions. So you were in that conference as one voice among many that she called the conference Tending the Threshold. If I can just give my own interpretation of what that meant is from these different voices, yourself included, y'all were speaking about different ways that we can generate alternative ways of being and doing as human beings, as we are somewhat collapse aware in these times. It seemed to be the universal theme. And whether that was collapse in terms of what we've created for ourselves, in terms of social justice issues, those were well covered in that conference. And for yourself, the post-growth institute that you've started and speak from quite a bit, what is it like that if we were to start co-creating an alternative to the predatory growth-based system that is indeed killing us and so many other species on the planet? It was really quite a remarkable conference to be in, and from so many different perspectives. Y'all had the voices of, if not this, then what? And why I specifically wanted to speak with you, Donnie, is I was really moved when I read that article. It's one thing to get thank goodness there are many articles these days of people rallying to support those in need in their community, and God knows whether it's COVID or another natural disaster, and on the list goes. But what really it literally stopped me in my tracks. I stopped breathing out of just a wonderment, like, oh my God, this is not just a bunch of folks rallying in a good way to support their neighbors, and that's a good thing. But this was multidimensional. This was, you had it, the way I keep talking about it with friends is you had wave after wave that y'all one way or another had come up with. And what I mean by that is there was a first aid wave, like literally the next day after this firestorm just obliterated parts of a couple towns. You started to gather yourselves together to see how can we help and what's needed and what's going on out there, meaning who needs help and why, meaning there are people stranded who can't get out of where they are, meaning they don't have transportation, they're too old, too infirm, something, and they might not have access to water, electricity, medicine, so on. And so I'm eventually here I'll stop talking, and I thank you so much for your patience as I just let you know why I so much wanted you to be here. So it was that first aid level. Then behind that was, we now have more than, close to 2,500 residences, and the people within those. So I don't know, 4,000 people. I don't know what the count is. Maybe you do. But thousands of people who are now homeless, like right now, no kidding. So that second wave was, what can we do to create viable short-term housing now? That would have been a great stopping point and breathtakingly strong and good and clear. But you had a third wave. And the third wave was what most impressed me, because I worked in the building and planning department of both Ashland and the county. And I know what it takes to have things move through those systems. And it's not a fast system, and it's not particularly a forgiving system for people who have good intentions, but maybe not enough money, or maybe not enough wherewithal to do the various procedures that are needed to be taken care of. So you had the third wave, which was, okay, those of us who know about that kind of stuff, from the building to the planning to the architecture and so on, stepping up. And I'm sorry to make this so long, but I am moved by this. This is not just a bunch of blathering detail. This is ridiculously thoughtful motion in also a very, very short period of time. And so the final piece that I just by the end of this short article, I was just bordering on tears, because the final piece that got my attention was the gathering together of people with the wherewithal to create alternative financing, to start the conversation of how could we make this accessible, because what we're looking at is the vast majority of the people who've lost their homes are not the wealthy folks that are, you know, up in the hills and so on, and have the wherewithal to just replace their home like that. So it's community financing, it's alternative financing, it's some number of people very thoughtfully bringing their ability to resonate with one another in a good way, to come up with how can we make this an event from which we can not only crawl back to some kind of stability over years, but actually, can we make this something from which we can thrive starting right away? That's how it all rang to me. Like, there's a guy named Bob Doppelt's got a book called Transformational Resilience. And in the middle of his definition of transformational resilience is basically, he's asserting that it is possible for us to not just survive or endure some traumatic event, but with enough adaptation and learning and building of skills and capacity, we can actually learn to grow and thrive in the midst of it. And then, of course, there's post-traumatic growth, and we can get to that. So thank you so much for your patience sitting through all that, but all of it was necessary just for my heart to thank you, and, you know, broadly through all the other folks involved with those 3 layers. So Donnie, thank you. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and what you do and how you do it, and anything from there that you'd like to add or change or correct about how you see these past couple of weeks and what y'all have been doing, that would be a great start.
Well, thank you, Dean, and to all those watching, because in hearing you speak it through, it is a way for me to synthesize the experience as well, having not had a lot of time to process 3 weeks on from this disaster. That I was just reflecting with a colleague today. We're thinking of maybe getting this bike brigade that we pulled together to ride back through Talent and Phoenix. And we've just connected that with some kind of opportunity for meal delivery services. And I think the reason I'm so keen to get that brigade back out on the road again is because it's so easy, especially with the sun shining and the smoke having gone, to disconnect from the reality that 5 miles up the road, we have half of a town wiped out. Another 3 miles up the road, we have half of another town wiped out. We have 40,000 people displaced in a valley of, 120,000 people. I mean, the numbers are shocking. They're just shocking. And people are living in vehicles, they're living in tents, they're living with family members, they're living with friends. And we know the crises are going to continue to cascade. And yet, as my colleague Teresa Cisneros says, building on what you mentioned earlier about Bob's book, the answer to historical trauma is historical healing. And there is healing that is being done right now, in a large part because of intention. The intention to have an equity lens, to look at these things from a space with colleagues who are aware and humble enough, many of them white, to consider that disasters don't happen in isolation from socioeconomic and racial discrimination, that they in fact often magnify those situations. And so to begin from that space, alongside an understanding that I've certainly had the privilege to develop over the last 15 years of work in Australia with people like Dee Brooks, Peter Kenyon, and others in the work of asset-based community development, a lot of which I learned in my time in Western Kenya and Kisumu, which says, start with what's working in communities, build on the existing strengths. And so one of the big undercurrents of the efforts that I've been involved with this bike brigade, with the Rogue Volunteers Initiative, with the My Valley, My Home project, all of these things, as you said, these waves of support, is essentially to build on the tenets of mutual aid. And those tenets are really interesting. I was just on a team call this morning because my background with the Institute, the Post-Growth Institute, is bringing a methodology to the world called the offers and needs market. It's a 90-minute process that matches people's offers with their needs, but gives them silent time to reflect on what do we have to offer, what do we need from each other, these kinds of things. And more than anything, because I think seen through a capitalist lens, those kinds of processes can often be interpreted as some kind of networking or extractive process where we work out what it is that we can take from each other. And the truth is that the experience we've cultivated is anything but that. It's about social capital and social relations building. It's about connecting deeply, giving people a chance to speak their truth, to reflect, especially the introverts, who often in this crazy world of talk, don't have time to reflect on what they want to share with each other. And from this space of offers and needs, in our team call this morning, there was the question, what's the difference between offers and needs markets and mutual aid efforts? And the truth is there isn't much, because in principle, they come back to the same tenet: solidarity, not charity. What that means is that we begin our work with community development, with post-disaster response, with an understanding of power dynamics existing from the very outset. And that if we're interested in social change, if we're interested in healing through collapse, then it's beholden on us to consider how we can heal the power dynamics that exist through the process. And one of the most powerful ways is to begin with what strengths all the players have. So the standard approach in typical post-disaster is to say, great, there's a lot of people who are going to donate things, time, money, goods, and there's people who are in need. And that's actually super problematic. That's a way that perpetuates class structure, social structure, and separation within the system. The way you break that down is, in the case of this bike brigade riding again, for example, you frame a post on social media that instead of saying, hey, we need 30 volunteers to go and deliver meals, which reinforces that notion of there's people who don't have anything and we're the saviors. And instead you say something like, there's a fantastic food distribution system that's been set up in Talent, and we're looking for some volunteers to help build that out, to help support that. And that subtle difference there of saying there's an existing strength, or of acknowledging the immense family ties within the Latinx communities that were so affected by these fires, and to say, these folks are looking after their own families and they're maintaining their kids' welfare while they're trying to juggle jobs during the day and find, perhaps in undocumented circumstances, ways to safely get to work, etc., etc. Look at the resilience there, not in a patronizing way, not in a, wow, look at how amazing those folk are at being able to continue despite the odds, but to understand that to be resilient is a skill and a cultural aspect that has been cultivated on the very basis of mutual aid efforts for decades, generations, millennia. In other words, it's in the cells often of the poorest, the most affected by disasters, that the answers to that healing lies. Because it is in solidarity. It's in changing the narrative and changing the dynamic in terms of how the narrative is spoken. And so when post-disaster situations bring forth that collaborative, collectivist aspect that we're being called to do with COVID as well, wear a mask to help others, when that comes forth and it remains central, and human dignity by way of understanding that everyone enters these spaces with a whole range of gifts and things, and that power dynamics need to be considered at every point, and that we need to look through an equity lens at the way we operate, then we really have the opportunity to match my own background, which was in looking at the work of E.F. Schumacher and Small is Beautiful and appropriate technology. And what does it mean to actually find a path forward that's not the modernity piece, and it's also not part of a system that is just going to get rolled over the top in terms of subsistence in a capitalist system. And so I think there are paths forward, and they build on deep knowledge that exists in ourselves, and particularly in the cells of many of those most affected in these circumstances.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. So what I'm hearing you say is that part of this reframing is founding it, or framing the core framing that I hear you describing is that there is likely generations worth of resourcing, from deeply inner resourcing to the outer layers of family, neighborhood, community, and so on. And that if that is the foundation on which recovery efforts are built, for instance, that there is some opportunity there to have possibly a more empowering, more inclusive result created, so that a community that has recovered in that framing may just come out more with more equity, with more common ground to be shared with what could be seen as the dominant paradigm or the dominant population in an area. Is that in the ballpark of what you're saying?
Absolutely. Let me give you an example of that might make the most sense here. Let's say that in a community, there was already an existing passion around taking on the capitalist forces that were making rental costs in a mobile home park extremely, extremely stressful for families. And that was in those communities as like an unspoken passion that was waiting to be released, because folk have been enduring these challenges for a long time, and also because there's a history of standing up for social justice issues, for thinking in collectivist ways, especially when you live in mobile home parks. You know, that often is very closely knit communities that, because of financial stresses in some of those mobile home parks, people need to rely naturally on each other. So what's happened now is that the conversation around buying out some of these mobile home parks that have been razed to the ground, and already the discussions are to throw in more units. Certain companies have bought adjacent properties, et cetera, et cetera. I've never seen that conversation galvanized so quickly to think about a community land trust model, or a limited equity housing cooperative model, or shifting something over to a community development corporation. And not just the conversation, but I've heard people come to the table with money, with ideas. And that's sort of at the more theoretical end compared to what happens in terms of when people just look after each other from the spaces of their existing strengths and the things that they still have to share under circumstances of stress. But it gives you a sense of just what can be mobilized through these times. I mean, that I can even talk about post-capitalism in conversations where we have members, senior executives from some of the biggest banks in the world on the call. And there's a permission to do that under these circumstances, but it also taps into, and this is the crucial bit, Dean, this is the bit that never gets spoken. I do an experiment with people all around the world where I ask them to draw a line down the middle of a piece of paper. And on the right-hand side, we're going to do a drawing about relates to the future. And then on the left-hand side, we're going to do something that relates to the present. And I ask them to start on the right-hand side, imagining a future that works for everyone. People, planet, an economy that serves everyone. And then I ask them, once you've imagined that, to drop into your heart or to your body and to feel it. What does it feel like? What would it feel like to be in that future? And then when they've connected with that feeling, I ask them to draw a symbol or a shape that represents how it feels in that future. To be in an economy that's working for everyone, all species. Once they've done that, we move to the left-hand side and we draw something for the present. How does the present economy feel? Now, having done this experiment across cultures, demographics of all sorts, it continues to amaze me that people always draw one of 4 symbols for the future and one of 4 for the present. For the future, they always draw a circle, an infinity symbol, a spiral, or a heart. And for the present, they always draw a jagged line, a triangle, a downward arrow, or a mess of lines. What this tells me, and this is a strengths-based approach that I'm putting on here. What this tells me is that within each of us, not only do we know what is needed for an economy or a future to work, and that is something to be circulating, for there to be fluidity, for there to be non-linearity built in, but we also know that there's nothing circular, truly circular about our present economy. Mm-hmm. So when I'm on the call and I'm mentioning these things like post-capitalism with senior executives at big banks, what I'm actually doing there without people realizing is tapping in at the opportune moment to an existing strength, which is that their wisdom already knows the things we're talking about here. And they didn't have the permission to go there in other conversations. The time wasn't right. These kinds of commonalities of strengths of perspective that bind us together as human beings, that essentially just can be defined as our shared wisdom, are there, and they're waiting to be revealed. And these moments can offer opportunities for that revealing.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Donnie. I'm curious, do you have a name for that moment? And the moment I'm talking about, you just described, it's when an executive in a bank who has basically 0 opportunities, like you're describing, in their usual workaday world. What they get to do is provide maximum reward for their shareholders, period. That's all they ever get to talk about. So there's this moment that you're describing when, through perhaps your descriptions and other aspects of this call or conversation you're in, they see some other way that is actually calling to them and to everyone on the call to see and presence themselves differently. So I'm curious if you have a name for that. I mean, that's truly a distinction to me.
I would say that more than anything, it's not what they see so much as what they feel.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that the trick is to not then lay out a path for how they can connect that feeling with the future that they want, because that's the history of of capitalist dominating paradigms, is to tell everyone, once you've made it clear for them that there's something needs to happen, to then sort of spell it out. And the trick here is for people to go on their own journey. And so really it's a reconnecting, a remembering that there is something important here. I mean, I often talk about families and how in the informal economy, and there's amazing work of people like J.K. Gibson Graham in this sort of space, the space of human geography, where no family member, no parent, I'm a parent of a 17-year-old, and he's not going to turn 18 and then say to me, and I'm going to turn to him and say, right, here's the bill for raising you, right? There's never that expectation. It's just a given that we have this reciprocity and this caring economy in that way. Yet we live in an economy that devalues that constantly, marginalizes that, says that's different from our market economy, and market economy couldn't operate that way. And it's true, it couldn't operate on that basis entirely, in my opinion. We couldn't live just totally in the gift economy, at least not for some time. But what happens then is, in the marginalization, we disconnect from the truth that those models exist, that 50% from the data I've seen by Duncan Ironmonger in Australia, almost 50% of our economic value, were it to be costed out, comes from things with no monetary exchange. So it's about reconnecting with the truth that we often do things from spaces of altruism, from cooperativism, etc. That the dominant narrative is that humans are greedy, and sometimes they can be altruistic, but mostly we're greedy. And that's just a story. And so the reconnecting that happens then allows people to see the world through that new lens, that remembered lens. Oh yeah, there is a credit union that is not for profit in my community. Oh my God, there are so many people that volunteer at my local theater company. Oh wow, I do notice how many people leave out excess produce and say, please take whatever you'd like. Oh wow, I am really interested in the meal services that are provided for our unhoused community and the way it really restores dignity. So like, once you see things through that different lens of possibility, that it doesn't have to always be the linear extractive, and that there are mechanisms already through which things naturally circulate, it's a different path to go down, and it opens up wonderful creative opportunities. And this is the last piece I want to add to this that's really important. It really relates to this collapse conversation. When we begin conversations around what's unfolding now, with what's wrong and what's not working, and I'm going to suggest, Dean, and I could be wrong here, but I'm going to make an assumption that part of the reason that the article you read about what we've been up to touched you so much is because it played a sequence that I'm going to explain in just a second, of beginning with what was good without shying away from what really needed to be considered in the long run here, without sugarcoating it and saying this is all good and everything's going to be fine and look at how amazing people are. And the difference there is this: when we begin with what's working, we take people into that frontal neocortex, right, which is the space of creativity, which allows you to then riff off an idea and say, well, what could I do in my community? Or where am I seeing these opportunities and how can I plug in? If you were to analyze the literature on collapse, or the literature on post-capitalism or alternative economics, if you were to pull from anyone's bookshelf a book that outlines these sorts of issues, my experience is that at least 90% of the time, the first chapter will be focused on what's wrong and what's problematic. And if that's the case, we're in this part of the brain, which is not a creative space to operate from. So the healing, the hope, I get excited when we begin with what's working as a vehicle to go into what's not. Hearing that people in my community are paying $1,100 a month in a mobile home park rent on houses that they already own because the massive corporate is gouging. When I hear that, I'm more motivated to act because the first thing was I noticed the passion of this galvanizing effort around this that made me inspired. And then I can go into what's wrong and feel like, great, I've got something to build on here. It's like the almost in the heroine's journey, like you start off with something that's just neutral or good before you go down into the problem. And then you've got a tether that you can come back to in this story arc, in this narrative, to say, yes, there can be something hopeful because I began with something good and strong that I can hold on to here. That really excites me in this space.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I really get it seems like two different kinds of reframing and resourcing that you're talking about. One is that cultural, familial, even individual resourcing, and framing, starting with a lineage of that whenever possible. And then I also hear you saying a framing of what's available, what's working, what's positive, what can I appreciate in this situation as a starting point. And then from there, from having gathered some of those elements, it makes you far better prepared to go into that. If we could think of it as a hero's journey, it could allow you to make that descent and have something that you can call on when you get to the tough parts of that descent. Because I think we're in times that are extraordinary in their difficulty. So you were about to say something.
Well, it makes me think to add one piece here that I want to give those watching this the most practical tool I can for how you can always deeply help in any kind of crisis circumstance. And it loops back to this power dynamic piece I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm going to explain it by way of, well, modeling it. The most powerful thing we can do in any kind of circumstance where we are seeking to help others is to listen for what's good and well and strong and reflect that back, while also listening for what's not working. But to begin by reflecting what's good. And the reason I feel so sure about this is having studied international development and operated in that field for some time. The standard approach historically to international development, and this has corollaries with community development, is the missionary approach. People will come in, they've got the answers, they're going to help you solve your problem, etc. Often enshrined in some kind of religious doctrine. The approach that's become normalized, especially through the United Nations and its subsidiary groups, has now been called capacity building, probably since the 70s, in fact. And typically people will be taught to come in and listen to communities, to do listening circles, to build rapport. And here's my question, Dean. What is it if those of us are involved in listening circles or listening to community or finding out what's going on, what is it that we're actually listening for? In my experience, we're taught to listen to needs. I'm going to go and listen to the Latinx community in order to hear what they need so that the thing that I'm working on can be customized. And let me be clear, the needs are crucial. But immediately, if I go and I listen through the lens of needs only, I am perpetuating the power dynamic of the saviorism. If I listen and I ask questions, and this is important where the framing piece is so important, if instead of asking like, what do you need? Or tell me about your circumstances and leaving it at that, I say something like, who do you trust right now? What organizations do you most trust? What has your community been able to do in response to what's happening? Where are you feeling? And of course, you need to be sensitive with these questions to ensure they're not insensitive to the desperate needs sometimes people are in. Where has your community gone through something like this before, and what worked really well?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of training in asking those kinds of questions and framing is almost non-existent. The work of appreciative inquiry and asset-based community development tries to fill that void, but it's so culturally deep, especially among white folk, to ask in that way, that we can change the system by the very way that we engage from the beginning. To ask, to listen from a space of reflecting back needs. Because think about how it feels. If you're someone who's being told you have nothing, oh my gosh, that group of people just lost everything, to have someone say, wow, I'm really impressed with XYZ, or gosh, it's amazing how your kids are still able to be out in the street playing with each other's kids, you know, like that you're juggling so much, that's so amazing. Like just to reflect back some of that human dignity of witnessing the strengths of the resilience rather than just talking about it as something separate. So that's my parting thought on that is the way we enter these conversations can totally change. It's actually a way of decolonizing our engagement, is to think about how our framing can affect our power relationships and how that all can affect the possibilities for moving through this in a way that's healing rather than reinforcing some of the deep, painful patterns that exist in our societies.
Yeah. Well, that's just great, Donnie. I so appreciate you laying that particular piece out. You know, it's kind of the closing of the envelope that you opened up with the same kind of emphasis of resourcing, and then, you know, finishing it out that way. And I would like to just share with you, you know, in my work with living resilience and a thing that we call Deep Academy, which is a series of video learning series that really give people a kind of a foundation or a gateway into being collapse aware. And it can be such a daunting conversation to even consider what we're in collapse, you know, but at some point, many of us have something in our gut that just says, this is really not right. And so they cross that threshold. And one of the most recent pieces that I produced was a complete revamp from something that I had completed in 2019, thinking, okay, this piece is done. Now we can move on to other learning series. And it's the one on resilience. And I did a couple of major shifts after, you know, post-COVID and post much of the protest activity that's been going on in this year. I'm really pleased with a couple of the resources that I've included quite a bit of their work. One is Elaine Miller-Karras's team at the Trauma Resource Institute. And they've got a program that has trained a number of professionals and volunteers around the world to be part of a team that comes into, let's say, a community that's had a massive fire or a hurricane, or you have high school gyms full of families that are now homeless and so on. And their approach, I went and did their facilitator training at Trauma Resource Institute, and they had a whole lot of what you're pointing at in place. They really they shared it as a lesson hard won that over time, because they didn't have that obviously for some number of years, and to reorient themselves going in to that multidimensional lens of resourcing that you keep talking about. I'm just pleased to be able to pass that on to you. You may want to just, one of y'all in your institute might want to just go check out their facilitator training, which is very worthy, spending a few days with them and getting that information and seeing how an organization that does provide that kind of service around the world, it made my system relax a little bit to know that they are deeply committed to the kind of evolution you're talking about, to staying with eyes wide open to what is shadow here, what are long-standing disempowerment habits in what we're trying to put out here, and how can we evolve it in a good way. And I just wanted to pass on some good news there. I certainly don't know the whole field. I don't know all the other, competitors, if you will, for, those kind of services. But I can speak highly of Elaine and her team. And there are a couple of organizations that are, I think, doing a decent job of really mining Bob Doppelt's work for what I think are, if a family, if a neighborhood, if an organization has some amount of space to be able to do some of the longer term expansion of capacities and skills building in themselves, I think his work is a decent place to start for some. I think it's probably as problematic depending on the culture or cultures that are included. But I have also seen a tremendous amount of good work being derived out of transformational resilience. So, you mind if I shift gears a little bit? So I'm aware for myself that as I'm putting out the work that I do, which is offering transformative resources and support for people who are bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. That's the elevator pitch of my work. I've handled, about 8 years worth of being in the abrupt climate change conversation and any of a dozen other global scale existential concerns that we have that I'm sure I actually imagine you might have far greater knowledge of them than I do. So I've been hanging in okay. I've been expanding my own practices and expanding my own capacities and skill sets, and I feel like I've been doing pretty well until this year. And this has really just strained the shit out of my capacities and my ability to continue to be present in the face of wave after wave daily, as we are all now experiencing and have been experiencing for quite some time. I'm wondering if you would be willing to share anything that you would about how you're doing, how your team's doing, anything that you might like to share about what our some of the larger scale concerns that you have as a father, as a community member, as a global citizen, the things that challenge you, and then anything you'd like to share about how you face it. How do you build out your capacity? How do you self-regulate, co-regulate? How do you hang with folks in a good way so that you can make it through day by day?
I used to think I was an extrovert, and maybe the extrovert introvert spectrum is less, clearly defined, and it's more complex than either or. But I've noticed over the last, I still think I probably am an extrovert by nature, but I've noticed over the last 3 or 4 years that when people ask questions of me in group settings, not only do I train others to take the time to just reflect, to create the inclusive space for those with more introverted tendencies, but I'm finding myself, I need more time. I want more time. So one of the most proactive things I've been doing is to ask for more time in meetings that I'm in, to proactively slow them down, to try to take more time during my day. I still struggle with taking a breath, and maybe could use more of those apps and timers and things like that. I look at this through the lens of masculine, feminine, and not linked to any kind of gender. And to me, this world is driven literally by the lens of masculine, the doing, right? And so I feel like we're being called into a space of more just being, and being in the feminine, in the unknown, in the internal, active in the internal, inactive in the external world. And so cultivating that practice of being internal, physically putting my hand on parts of my body, doing somatic kind of work has been helpful. But also over the last 10 years, I set up the Institute virtually 10 years ago with 9 others that I invited to a Skype meeting. And 10 years ago, the internet wasn't quite where it's at today, and it crashed within a few seconds. And so our meeting went to typed. And that meant that, and we still have fully typed meetings to this day. About half of our meetings are done that way. And that was a game changer, because all of a sudden the power dynamics changed when you have a meeting where you're watching people type and you have time to reflect, and the chair doesn't move on until someone's finished typing. And you're sitting at a computer somewhere in the world or on a phone with people from all around the world. At the moment, our team meetings often have 20, 25 people, and you're there in silence. That has been interesting. That has been a way to cope. And so when COVID came around, I was already working with people virtually every day in a way that's different to the standard way. So commonly I hear people say, oh my gosh, I've got Zoom fatigue. And I get that. I have been there many times. But with my team, and everyone says this, we have people from 9 countries around the world. We have probably meetings running every single day. We spend often half an hour of a 90-minute meeting just checking in, doing a grounding process, spending the time, not commenting on each other's, where people are at, just honoring it. And that co-regulation, which is the word that one of the participants used this morning, has been a lifesaver. So I always thought that finding my tribe would look like a physical thing, and it may well, and I still do have aspects of that. But I'm in a country that feels foreign to me, and I found most of my community online, and I absolutely push back on the idea that you can't have deeply nurturing relationships through the screen. Mm. I found it to be the opposite. If anything, actually, I would argue that it can be at least the same level. And in some ways more because of the ability to add in silence, the ability to watch someone directly in a different way that isn't as awkward for some people. I mean, I've had moments where I've connected with colleagues in silence for a number of minutes, and we've just stared at each other and just connected in that deep, powerful way. I also use things like a Swedish healing mat, which you can find online for like $10, 8,000 little pins that you can lie on. And I use that if I've got any neck pain, back pain, etc. I do exercise every day. That's an important part for me, is just getting the blood flowing. But I'm also trying to do exercise differently to how I used to. It used to be all about the masculine, getting out and really like pulling on that rowing machine. And I still do that, but I'm aware of how that can be also part of that addiction to just doing. So again, trying to find things like yin yoga has been really powerful for me, which is, if anyone's not familiar with it, is a slow hold, 5-minute hold, gentle, internal, working with the fascia kind of process. Flotation tanks, if anyone has the ability to ever get into a flotation tank, and they're not always unaffordable, that's a great way to work with sleep deprivation. I'm dealing personally with what I think is Epstein-Barr virus flare-up and extreme fatigue. Half an hour before this call, I could barely move. And so it's real. And being a parent amidst all of this, finding that balance of knowing that my kid is seeing a lot of things anyway, and that at age 17, I'm not going to be holding them back in a way that would be inappropriate in terms of restricting access to information. But also knowing that the words that I say and the gravitas as someone who's collapse aware imprint a lot in a young child's mind, even a late stage teenager's mind. So ensuring that I keep hopeful at times where it's appropriate, but that I'm also genuine, that I focus on the love and the connection as a parent, and stewarding this sort of process for a kid to find their way through in a time that, identity, role confusion, all of these things are coming up at a time where we're barely making sense of what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I think holding that, what I try to do is hold the container in a way which is, I'm the rock that's not leaving. I'm here for you through all this. You can always come back to me as you go out and explore the world. So I think being a rock for our children, just as other people are my rock that I come back to and I know they're there, those anchoring pieces to me become very important. Those relationships, I actually went through a process of, in the last 5 years, looking at who I wanted to really build out my relationships with, and realizing that it was totally unsustainable to have this massive network. And so I have about 25 relationships that and I have to keep it in a list, which is crazy, right? But I have a list of people that I cycle through to remind me who I want to spend time with.
Yes.
So those are some of the things that I do to get through.
Beautiful list. I'm not used to that level of articulation. I actually have that for myself, and I'm very impressed and appreciative of your list. Not just the people, but all those items of self and co-regulation that you just spoke of. I'd like to just emphasize a particular point. I've done a lot. I'm not a parent myself, but I've done a lot of work over the years with at-risk youth and parenting community development groups around those issues. And there's a big difference between how someone could have used the same words that you just used about being the rock for, so excuse me if there's some noise that is in the background, but in any case, you mentioned about being the rock for your child. And what I'm not hearing is how it was often expressed in the past, which is to be that rock, is to continue the basically the lie of our culture that starts with infinite growth on a finite planet, and then our particular role within that. Where do I fit in? Going to be the breadwinner? How is that complicit in some way? Those are just unexplored issues that now, in so many different ways, are showing up, that those who are collapse aware, those who are engaging with a level of integrity that I hear you describing in your life and your relationships. I hear that being the rock is, yes, your son can return to you no matter what, and he can count on you to tell the truth from your perspective in a loving way, is what I heard. So I hope I'm hearing that in a correct way. Is there any way you'd like to adjust that?
Not an adjustment, just an elaboration. So, for example, when my son comes to me and says, "What do you think about XYZ?" And it might be an issue as serious that relates to climate change or something that's happening politically. The first thing I'll do is say, "I'm really interested in hearing what you feel."
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm still there. He knows I'm going to share my perspective. His mother's done an incredible job of always giving him the ability to develop his own feminine, right? His own connection with wisdom. And so any child that's connected, and in my opinion, every child, especially in their early stages before the oppressive systems of many of the oppressive systems in our cultures push out the child's connection with their wisdom. That wisdom's there. And so as a parent, I seek to create the space for the child, for my son, to connect with his wisdom in ways that then I'm not needing to teach him about collapse, just like I don't need to teach the folk when I'm doing the drawing experiment about what's needed for the future and what's wrong with the present. They already know it. Mm-hmm. All I'm doing is being the custodian, the guardian, the caretaker, the support for that reconnection. And then my son knows that on the basis of what he feels and connects with, I'll share my perspective and I'll be there for him. We might have a different perspective. It might be, something's blocking either of us in terms of connecting with that wisdom, etc. But I think the key word that I'm looking to get through here is dependability. Kids need more than ever a sense of dependability when most things seem undependable. Mm-hmm. But that dependability doesn't mean control over. It doesn't mean you depend on me, therefore I have a power dynamic that controls you. It means I'm here to support your journey of exploring what truth looks like and what it means to navigate this, knowing that I will always be there for you throughout this process. And to me, that's what good friends do. It's what good couples do. It's what good communities do.
Mm-hmm. Donnie Maclurcan, it's just been an absolute joy to have this conversation with you and to spend this time with you and to find out more about what you've been doing in these years since you've been in Southern Oregon and a bit before. And I'll just be straight up with you. I'm going to be posting this not only in my podcast, The Poetry of Predicament, I'm going to be posting this in a sister podcast that we've got, which is called Take My Hand, Conscious Parenting in a Time of Stolen Dreams. And, it's just with great pleasure and pride that I can include you there as well. There are parents that just really need to hear from well-resourced, thoughtful, open characters like yourself. I'm just so pleased to have made this connection with you and to learn more about what you're doing. And then I'm clear also that you have got a place in, remember I was mentioning about the Deep Academy programs, the kind of video learning series, and that one on resilience. I can see the place where I want to put this interview because it's just, you've really personified particular aspects of both self-regulation and co-regulation and various resilience skills, from the very intimate and personal level all the way out to the community level and beyond. So I couldn't have asked for a better exemplar. And if I could just pause for a moment. There's the same part of me that was moved when I was reading the initial article is moved now. And remember I was mentioning that this year has been a real stretch for me to keep up my capacity with the demands of the space, of the global space. And one part, if I could just share for a moment, one part of me that's been kind of struggling under the weight of that is the part that started out as a kid, and I knew when I was watching Jacques Cousteau's specials, and he would mention about how we're destroying parts of the reef that he was exploring and so on. That really set the tone for me of what it was to be a really responsible adult in the world. And particularly these past couple of years have been, and especially again this year, has been shredding my ability to find inspiration, to find a balance to the massive destruction to the earth and human systems that's going on. And so I've been really looking for sources of inspiration that I can just keep in my heart, that I can get an impression in my system of it doesn't have to be like this. We can actually come from each other's resilience, each other's deep resourcing, and we can come from a co-generated future that we can all reach into together. Whether we'll be successful or not, I don't know. But I do feel that very positive impression on my system in speaking with you today. And so I thank you, and I thank your team for all you've been doing. And I look forward to the next time we get to talk.
Thanks so much, Dean. It's been a real pleasure to be here with you and to feel your heart and to connect with all those who are watching this as well today. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.